Imagine waking up one morning and not recognizing who you used to be. Only now, the choices that once felt urgent no longer tug at you. The conversations that once looped in your head have fallen quiet, and the temper that used to rise at small slights has become a different rhythm altogether. You would likely look for a dramatic cause, a new job, a relationship, a sudden revelation. The more honest and unsettling diagnosis is quieter. An operating system of ideas, rituals, and attentional habits has been running in the background, and over time it rewired what you notice, how you narrate experience, and therefore who you are. There is a set of aphorisms attributed in the Western tradition to Hermes Trismegistus and later gathered under the label Hermetic that reads like a manual for invisible mental architecture. Taken literally, these laws are old metaphysical claims. Read psychologically, they are surprisingly modern. They name how attention, habit, ritual, framing, and projection organize perception. They do their work not by thunder or spectacle, but by shaping what your mind treats as foreground and what it lets remain unseen. If you prefer cold language, repeated frames create stable prediction chains. Ritualized attention strengthens neural pathways. Narrative consolidation recodes memory around new interpretive hooks. If you prefer a poetic frame, like an alchemist heating the crucible in small, patient increments, these principles shift base impressions into a different alloy, what Jung would call an inner gold of consciousness, the slowly changing shape of the self. This is why the change can be stealthy. The mind is a habitat. Adjust the habitat and the inhabitants. The habits, desires, interpretive habits eventually change. Here is a short orientation to the 7 principles we'll be unpacking and testing as psychological levers, listed as practical summaries rather than metaphysical decrees. Mentalism, mind shapes perceived reality. Correspondence, as above, so below, patterns repeat across scales. Vibration, everything is in motion, patterns are rhythmic. Polarity, everything has opposites that are degrees of the same thing. Rhythm, cycles move things between poles. Cause and effect, every action precipitates a chain, and gender, creative and receptive dynamics in all processes. Each of these names is a handle we can use to inspect how small, repeated shifts in attention and action recalibrate perception and behavior. Before we go deeper, a quick note. If you want the 7 short experiments to use across a week, one for each principle, save this video or subscribe now. I'll invite you to try them and journal what changes. This is not a promise of transformation. It's an invitation to carry an experiment into daily life and watch for subtle shifts. If what you uncover feels destabilizing, consider working with a trusted therapist or guide. The aim here is safe exploration, not clinical intervention. The first law, the principle of mentalism. Reality is filtered by mind. Think of it as the mind's initial claim. Your perception is not a neutral mirror, but an ongoing construction. In cognitive terms, this is close to predictive processing. The brain continuously anticipates sensory input, preferring interpretations that minimize surprise. The Hermetic twist is normative rather than mechanistic. It points out that the mind, your beliefs, metaphors, and repeated questions sets the parameters for what counts as real. Psychologically, mentalism rewires you by directing attention. Attention is selective and costly. Every time you habitually attend to something, shame, loss, scarcity, curiosity, you strengthen the pathways that make that class of stimuli more salient. Over time, what you expect to find in the world is what you reliably perceive. That is not a metaphysical trick, it's how brains economize. The Hermetic reading gives us a compact hypothesis. Alter the mind's foreground, and you slowly alter the world you inhabit. Jungian parallel. Jung described complexes as pattern formations, tendencies that organize perception in their own favor. When a complex is active, you see the world through its shape. If you move the mind's foreground, if you give attention different coordinates, you interrupt the authority of an old complex. Mentalism becomes a lever for individuation because it invites intentionality into what was previously automatic. Vignette. Imagine Emma, who grew up in a house where mistakes were loudly criticized. As an adult, she runs meetings on autopilot, hyper-alert to slips, quick to correct, and exhausted by the perceived incompetence of others. She assumes that errors mean incompetence. Her mind scans conversations for evidence of shoddy work. One morning she decides to ask a different question before a meeting. What small thing did someone do well this week? She spends a minute at the opening asking it aloud and noticing what she feels. Her attentional habit shifts, briefly at first, to spotting competence. She is surprised at how many small, competent acts had been invisible to her. Over weeks, her reporting changes. She notices competence more quickly, praises it, and her team responds. The pattern feeds back into her expectations, and without any dramatic inner work, Emma's professional identity softens from critic to builder. Micro-experiment, 60-90 seconds. For 1 week, start 2 of your mornings by asking one deliberate question, one that anticipates a positive but specific answer. It can be as small as, who did something today that made my day easier? Notice what your attention finds. Record one line in a phone note. This is not a pep talk. It's a conditional retraining of the anticipatory mind. You are choosing a lens. Mini-hook. If mentalism shows how choice of question redirects attention, the next principle, correspondence, reveals how the patterns you carve at one scale echo at others, so small changes bloom outward in geometry you can predict. The second law, the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. At its simplest, correspondence names pattern repetition across scales. In psychological language, motifs that operate within your private internal world reappear in relationships, work, and expressive life. The pattern is not mystical, it is systemic. If you carry a certain relational posture, avoidant, anxious, heroic, it will show similar signatures in finance, friendship, and leisure. Correspondence highlights the fractal nature of the psyche. Micro-habits replicate macro structures. Psychological mechanism, pattern projection, and narrative scaffolding. Humans are meaning-making machines. Once we find a pattern that explains an experience, we use it as a scaffold for interpreting disparate events. The brain favors coherence. When you detect a recurring theme in one part of life, you often import that explanatory theme into other parts. That importation is how recoding in one domain migrates to others. Change an interpretive schema in a small domain, and the brain applies the new schema elsewhere because it's efficient to reuse a working model. Jungian parallel. Jungian work often focuses on the way personal complexes mirror cultural myths. The inner narrative forms a template for outer life. Correspondence is essentially the idea that the same archetypal forms play out at multiple levels. Bringing awareness to a recurrent pattern in a small, contained context can therefore disclose much larger psychic structures. That is precisely why micro-change can trigger macro-reconfiguration. Vignette. Raphael is meticulous with his wardrobe but chaotic with deadlines. He treats his clothing as a zone where order matters and his desk as an exception zone where the rules don't apply. He begins an experiment. He applies the same small rituals he uses for clothes, checklist, timing, and a 5-minute wrap-up, to the first task of each day. Within 2 weeks he notices a reduction in internal friction around deadlines. The tidy ritual in one domain corresponded to a tidy ritual in another. His inner story, I'm careful about some things but let other things go, begins to collapse into a new story. Where I design structure, I get stability. That story migrates. Co-workers notice a different Raphael. The correspondence between micro and macro had been silent until he altered a single micro habit. Micro experiment, 2 to 3 minutes. Identify one micro domain where you already feel organized or particular. Your morning coffee, your email triage, your walking route. Deliberately apply one organizational ritual from that domain to a small, messy area. A drawer, a calendar block, an inbox folder. Observe for a week whether attention and feelings around the messy area shift. Journal a single sentence each evening about what moved. Mini-hook. Correspondence shows how small adjustments can map onto larger patterns, but what makes patterns feel alive is motion. The next principle, vibration, explains how rhythm and movement anchor expectation and attention, making certain narratives feel plausible and others invisible. The third law, the principle of vibration. Everything moves. Patterns are rhythmic. At first glance, vibration sounds mystical. Everything vibrates. But psychologically it points to temporality and rhythm. Cognition is temporally structured. Attention pulses, reward cycles trigger behavior, and emotional habit loops entrain perception. When you create a new cadence, daily gratitude, brief rehearsals of fear-tinged conversations, micro-rituals, the timing itself stabilizes new neural pathways. Rhythm is a scaffolding device. Psychological mechanism, entrainment, reinforcement schedules, and the power of micro-ritual. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to timing. Consider the difference between a praise given sporadically versus praise given on a reliable schedule. Predictable reinforcement strengthens habit differently. Short rituals, lighting a candle, setting a timer, 3 breaths before a meeting, anchor a mental state and create a predictable rhythm that the nervous system learns to expect. Over time, those rhythms create anticipatory physiology, lowered heart rate, reduced amygdala reactivity, or improved goal-directed focus. Rhythm is the skeleton onto which new experience attaches. Jungian parallel. Jung often wrote about the importance of ritual and repeated symbolic acts in maintaining psychic balance. Ritual is not only cultural ornamentation, it is a way the unconscious learns to trust the ego. Small repeated acts that carry symbolic weight help the psyche internalize new structures. Vibration, then, is the alchemical stirring, slow, patient motion changing the alloy's texture. Vignette. A teacher named Noor uses a bell to mark transitions in her classroom. 1 ring for attention, 2 rings for silence, a different pattern for reflection. The pattern is so consistent that the students' bodies come to anticipate the state shift, and the room's emotional temperature changes in seconds. Noor starts using the bell rhythm before faculty meetings with a small ritual. 3 rings, 1 breath, 1 question. Staff, initially bemused, find meetings shorter and less reactive. The ritual's timing created an expectation that reorganized energy in the room, and that energy translated into new patterns of interaction over months. Micro-experiment, 90 seconds. Choose 1 small ritual to mark the beginning of a focused work block, 3 deep breaths and a 1-sentence intention, or a short stretch and a 30-second visual of the outcome. Do it for the next 5 focused sessions. Notice changes in the quality and elasticity of attention. Record 1 sentence about the felt difference. Mini-hook. Rhythm and timing make habit durable, but habit itself is often polar. Attraction and aversion polarize our responses. The next principle, polarity, reveals that opposites are often degrees of the same thing, a subtle reframe that dissolves hard divisions and offers leverage for reorientation. The 4th law, the principle of polarity. Opposites are identical in nature, different only in degree. Polarity is less an axiom than a perceptual correction. Extremes are endpoints on a spectrum. where the mind tends to split experience into binary judgments, good, bad, right, wrong. Polarity invites you to see gradations. This rewriting is not moral relativism. It's a cognitive softening that opens up possibilities. If resentment and gratitude are points on the same axis, learning to shift degrees becomes a practical skill rather than an ethical battle. Psychological mechanism, reappraisal and dimension reorganization. Cognitive reappraisal, actively shifting the interpretation of an event, works precisely because many emotional states inhabit a shared space. By gently nudging the degree of the experience, you can transform its qualitative feel. Behavioral activation draws on the same space. Small increases in rewarding behavior can move mood because the underlying affective system is dimensionally organized rather than compartmentalized. Jungian parallel, Jungian integration insists on holding opposites together, conscious and unconscious, shadow and light, so that neither dominates the psyche. Polarity, as a Hermetic principle, suggests a technique for that integration. Instead of purging the bad, explore its lesser and greater degrees, acknowledge its contribution, and create context where it can be redirected. This is the slow alchemy of tempering extremes. Vignette. Marcus considers himself a failure because one startup collapsed. For years, any risk triggered paralyzing avoidance. Uncertainty felt like a cliff. A mentor suggests he treat uncertainty like a muscle, practice small, controlled exposures, pitching a mini-project, committing to a low-stakes collaboration, tapering the intensity. Marcus discovers that his aversion isn't a categorical defect, but a position on a scale he can move along. Over months, he tolerates more risk and recalibrates his inner narrative from "I fail" to "I miscalculate sometimes and learn." The polarity of failure and competence rearranges into a gradient where growth is possible. Micro-experiment, 2 to 3 minutes. When you notice a strong reaction in the next 48 hours, irritation, shame, fear, pause and map it on a simple scale from 0 to 10. Ask what would move you 1 point toward the middle. Choose a small, concrete action that nudges that point, saying, "I need a minute," offering a piece of feedback calmly, writing a quick note of what you learned. This is not about avoidance, it's about practicing degree shifting. Mini-hook. Polarity softens binary judgments and opens a field for experimentation. But experiments unfold in time, and time imposes cycles. The next principle, rhythm, shows how cycles and periodicity lock patterns into place and, if attended to, can be used by you to guide change rather than being worn by it. At this point, we have 3 operative frames in hand: mentalism's lens, correspondence's pattern, and vibration's timing, and 1 practical reframe in polarity. They are not separate tools, but overlapping lenses. Consider for a moment how they combine in a trivial domestic scene. A person wakes to a morning ritual, vibration, asks a question that selects for possibility, mentalism, sees a pattern echo in work and relationship domains, correspondence, and uses an understanding of degrees to soften a defensive reflex, polarity. Each principle adds a lever that multiplies the other's effects. This is why the process is stealthy. The mind is not rewriting itself in a single moment. It is accreting changes at multiple interfaces, attention, habit, rhythm, and narrative, until what was once foregrounded is now in the background, and vice versa. We can begin to trace the arc of transformation with a Jungian map. The early phase often looks like rupture or a call. Something interrupts the complacent script. That rupture might be external, a job loss, an ending, or internal, a small, persistent dissatisfaction. Mentalism meets rupture as a choice. Which lens will you bring to this new rawness? Correspondence asks where similar patterns have shown. Vibration gives you the micro-ritual tools to stabilize a new stance. Polarity teaches you how to hold ambiguity while making incremental changes. These are, in a sense, preparatory moves, slowing the system, introducing a new question, practicing a small ritual, and reframing extremes as degrees. Together, these moves prepare you for the deeper descent that Jung describes, the conversation with the shadow where projection is returned and new symbolic content emerges. But there is an important reason this process is often unnoticed. The mind prefers continuity. It is easier to update the background settings of perception than to admit to a radical interior overhaul. Subtle reframes, asking a different question at breakfast, adopting a 1-minute ritual before meetings, mapping a feeling on a 0-10 scale, slip past the mind's gatekeepers because they do not require you to declare a new self publicly. They accumulate in private then, like lichen on rock, change the surface texture of the organism until erosion and growth have both been at work. Pause and consider that for a moment. The very strategies that make change possible, the small, private experiments, are the same strategies that render the change invisible. This is not an argument for stealthy manipulation. It's an explanation for the experience many report. I don't remember when it shifted. I just woke up one day and was different. The Hermetic frame offers language for that lived fact without turning it into a supernatural claim. It shows how repeated low-cost acts of attention and framing, mapped by pattern and stabilized by rhythm, can reconfigure the mind's attractor states. At the edge of that realization comes a practical question. How do you know if your mind has been rewired invisibly? There are signs to watch for, changes in what immediately grabs your attention, subtle shifts in the stories you tell about yourself, new emotional thresholds, altered social feedback, but they are often slow and cumulative. The experience may feel more like an unexpected ease in a situation that used to cause friction than like a dramatic epiphany. Part of the practitioner's skill, then, is learning to be a quality observer of small changes rather than a seeker of revelation. Before we move deeper into the next set of principles, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, let's make these first 4 laws practical for you through a short composite experiment. You can begin now. It ties together mentalism, correspondence, vibration, and polarity. Choose a single small domain in your life, a slot of time, an email routine, your posture while standing in line. For the next 5 days, do a short micro-ritual before entering that domain. 1 breath and 1 intentional question. Map any recurring patterns you notice that correspond to other life areas. And when a strong reaction arises, place it on a 0 to 10 scale and take 1 small step toward the center. This 3-part move, lens, mapping, degree shift, both illustrates how these laws operate and gives you a live test of whether subtle rewiring is possible. If you do this and the change unsettles you, remember that shifts in attention can destabilize identity. Ground myself? Sorry, let me rephrase. If shifts feel destabilizing, seek grounding in routine, community, and professional support if needed. Small experiments can surface neglected material. That's often useful, but when material feels large or dangerous, a guide is wise. There is one more thing to notice before we press on. Each of these interventions, questions, rituals, degree shifts, works because they reconfigure the mind's background assumptions. They do not force you to be someone else overnight. They make different invitations more possible, and this is the paradoxical power of the Hermetic set, not the ability to conjure a new self, but to render previously invisible possibilities visible by changing what you consistently notice. Now imagine the next law, rhythm, not as redundancy but as a different axis. While vibration invited micro-ritual and timing, rhythm introduces larger oscillations, weekly, seasonal, developmental, that carry larger psychic content and can orchestrate deeper transformation. The coming section will look at how rhythmic cycles slot the smaller rituals into larger narrative arcs, and how cause and effect stitches habits into chains, eventually creating a new center that feels like a new self. But before we go there, take a breath and ask yourself, which small domain did you just notice as a good place to begin? If you named one, you've already followed the first Hermetic commandment, turned attention into a deliberate instrument. Keep that attention. The next moves will teach you how to hold it across time, consequence, and creative polarity. The fifth law, the principle of rhythm. Cycles carry the story forward. If vibration named the micro-tempo and small rituals that steady attention, rhythm draws the larger arcs that give those rituals meaning. Rhythm names oscillation, the week and the season, the tide of appetite and aversion, the alternating currents of approach and withdrawal that shape a life. Psychologically, rhythm organizes expectation across time scales. It is not merely about repeating an action, but about aligning that repetition with a larger cadence, so the nervous system can anticipate, learn, and relax into a pattern. The mechanism here is both physiological and narrative. Nervous systems entrain to cycles. Sleep-wake patterns shape cognition, menstrual and circadian rhythms bias mood and focus, weekly patterns orient social exchange. Beyond the body, rhythms scaffold stories. A ritual repeated weekly creates a kind of punctuation in time, a moment where the psyche can breathe and notice itself. That punctuation allows for integration. The week becomes a crucible where small experiments can be observed, revised, and folded back into life. When you place micro-rituals inside a consistent rhythm, you give them a larger trajectory. They are no longer isolated events, but nodes in a developmental line. Jung often emphasized the need for ritual and symbolic marking of psychic movement. He noted that periodic acts, celebrations, fasts, symbolic gestures help the unconscious trust that change will be contained and intelligible. Rhythm, then, is the measure that keeps the alchemical fire from running wild while still allowing transformation. It is the metronome the psyche learns to dance to. Vignette. Lena's days had no cadence. Projects started in a burst and died in neglect. She tried to write, she tried to exercise, but nothing stuck. A friend suggested she adopt a weekly holding hour on Sunday evening, 60 minutes to review wins and strange moments from the week, to set one practical intention, and to close with a simple symbolic act. A cup of tea poured and set by a plant. It sounded ritualistic, but she tried it. Over months, the holding hour became a time her body recognized, a gentle decrescendo from the week's noise. Her attention began to nest around Sunday evening patterns. Minor corrections accumulated. Patterns that had lurked unnoticed surfaced. The weekly rhythm made her experiments legible. The small micro-rituals she practiced Monday through Friday now had a meeting point where feedback and narrative could congeal. Without a dramatic revelation, her internal weather changed. The anxiety storms reduced their intensity and frequency, not because of a single practice, but because of a pattern she had learned to expect. Micro-experiment 5 minutes weekly. Choose one fixed slot in the week you can guard, 45 minutes on the same day and time. Begin by listing 3 small observations from the prior week that surprised you, no judgment. Name one thing you want to try or continue, and close with a small symbolic act. A candle, a glass of water set down, 5 breaths. Do this for 4 weeks, and notice whether the weekly shape begins to reveal patterns you couldn't see in the daily bustle. Mini hook. Rhythm stitches micro-practices into a visible arc. It gives a place where cause and effect can be traced over time, and that is the next law's domain. The 6th law, the principle of cause and effect. Small causes seed long chains. Hermetic cause and effect reads simply, every event has a cause, and every cause yields effects. Psychologically, this is mundane truth and a powerful tool. Our actions, thoughts, questions asked aloud, rituals, are causes that set off cascades of reaction, both internal and social. The subtlety here is that many causes are low energy and unnoticed, a habit of greeting people cheerfully, a 2-minute pause before responding, a question that invites curiosity. Small causes proliferate because human systems are sensitive. They amplify, attenuate, or homologize signals according to pattern and context. Mechanically, this principle draws on feedback loops and contingent reinforcement. A seeded behavior creates a probabilistic chain. You act, the world responds, your expectation adjusts, and the updated expectation alters future action. The chain can be stabilizing or destabilizing. What Hermetic writing emphasizes, when read psychologically, is intentionality in seeding causes. If you want the mind to be rewired, place small, intentional causes into your life that favor the emergent patterns you want. Over time, these small causes create new attractors for attention and identity. Jung's perspective on causality in psychic life was nuanced. He didn't reduce transformation merely to behavior, but he acknowledged that symbolic acts lead to change precisely because they alter relations between conscious stance and unconscious content. A small symbolic intervention can shift the current of projection, invite dialogue with repressed material, and change the meaning landscape in which future causes occur. Cause and effect, then, is the ethic of planting. Vignette. Maya had a habit of starting emails with a terse directive. Her responses returned terse directives. Her inbox became a field of brittle interactions. She experimented with one small cause. For every email that required a directive, she began the reply with a one-sentence acknowledgement of something that went well in the other person's contribution. It cost her an extra 10 seconds. The patterns shifted. Replies softened, tone lengthened, and collaborative energy increased. Over months, meetings that were formerly tense shifted tone. A tiny communicative cause initiated a cascade that rewired not just inbox style, but her internal narrative about leadership, from fixer to steward. Micro-experiment, 2 to 3 minutes. For your next 3 social interactions, emails, texts, a short conversation, choose one small cause to introduce intentionally. Ask a question that invites 2-sentence reflection, offer a concise, genuine compliment, or pause for 3 heartbeats before replying. Note immediate responses, and then record one line about any downstream change in tone or behavior over the next day. Mini hook causes ripple. When paired with rhythm, they become reliable engines of slow transformation. But to fully integrate what changes, we need a principle that explains creative and receptive forces, how new patterns are conceived and how they receive form. That is gender, the 7th law, the principle of gender, creative and receptive forces in psychic life. Hermetic gender is rarely about biological sex in a psychological reading. Instead, it names a polarity present in all processes, a generative initiating principle, creative, and a forming receiving principle, receptive. Think of it as 2 modes of mind. The creative mode sparks novelty, ideas, actions, movement. The receptive mode nurtures, shapes, tests, and completes. Both are necessary for transformation. In daily life, creative without reception scatters. Receptive without creativity stagnates. The genius of this principle is its insistence on complementarity rather than dominance. Psychological mechanism. Cognitive flexibility and integrative practice. Creative modes are associated with divergent thinking, risk, and projection. Receptive modes correlate with reflection, testing, and containment. Rewiring occurs fastest when you can deliberately move between these modes, when you generate experiments and then create a container where those experiments are noticed and refined. The psyche needs both the spark and the crucible. Jung's animus and anima speak to this dynamic. These figures represent internalized templates of creative and receptive energies that color our inner dialogue and relationship patterns. For Jung, integrating animus, anima was part of individuation, learning to use both voices rather than being possessed by one. Gender, as a Hermetic principle, invites you to practice that balance at a pragmatic level. Designate times for free generativity and times for careful reception and evaluation. Both give each other permission to exist. Vignette. Omar was brilliant at starting projects. He had stacks of half-complete prototypes, but he rarely finished anything. He loved the rush of ideation, but couldn't hold a slow, patient attention to follow through. A coach suggested a simple frame. Every creative hour, an unstructured time for idea generation, must be followed within 48 hours by a receptive hour, a focused review, testing or pruning. He tried it and found that the receptive hour turned wild seeds into cultivable rows. The creative hours grew less frantic because a reliable receptive practice existed to receive them. The two modes in tandem rewired his work rhythm. Where there was once chaotic novelty, there became a productive alternation that made identity, innovator, and finisher feel coherent. Micro-experiment, 3 to 5 minutes. For the next week, reserve 2 short slots each day, 1 purely creative, no editing, free association, sketching, and 1 purely receptive, review, annotate, choose 1 small refinement. Keep the creative slot time-bound and the receptive slot practical. Decide 1 next step. After a week, note whether your output feels more completed and whether the emotional valence of starting versus finishing has shifted. Mini hook. Gender completes the set. With creative sparks, receptive forms, rhythmic scaffolding, small causes, and attentional lenses, you have a toolkit that operates below declarative awareness. But how do these tools connect into the deep arc Jung described? How does consistent practice across these 7 laws yield the sort of remaking people sometimes described with the language of finding myself or waking up different? That is where the mapping to psychological stages helps. Mapping the 7 laws onto a developmental arc, from rupture to a new center. The work of transformation seldom follows a straight line. It tends to be a spiral, cumulative, integrative, and often counterintuitive. If we follow a Jungian scaffold of rupture, encounter, descent, reconciliation, emergence, we can see where each Hermetic principle tends to act most potently, knowing that none of them is confined to a single stage, and that the real work is iterative. Rupture. A rupture is the wake-up, an inner disquiet, a loss, a disappointment. In this early phase, mentalism is crucial. You choose a lens. Will this rupture be one more proof of unworthiness or an invitation to inquiry? The way you frame the rupture will influence where attention goes. Mentalism gives you the instrument to select which narrative will start to organize the wound. Encounter. The encounter is meeting the shadow, the parts you disowned that now demand recognition. Correspondence becomes useful here. You trace the pattern across domains. How does this wound show up in work, relationship, money? Seeing the same motif across scales reduces mystification and grants leverage. Change one node, and the pattern can shift more broadly. Descent. Descent is the hard work, dialogue with the unconscious, often messy. Vibration and rhythm are allies here. Daily micro-rituals, predictable cadences, and small emotional habits create a safety of predictability where descent can proceed without the ego dissolving. They provide the scaffolding that keeps the psyche from flailing. Reconciliation. This is the integrative phase. Polarity and gender do the settling work, teaching you to hold opposites and to let creative and receptive forces work together. Reappraisal, degree shifting, and alternating modes of mind allow the shadow to be acknowledged without taking over. Emergence. The new center appears when cause and effect have had time to run their chains and the new attractors have settled. Small causes, repeated within a rhythm and framed by mentalism, produce social and intrapsychic effects that over time feel like new orientation. The person may wake and find their habitual worry has receded, or a small curiosity has become a vocation. Emergence is less a final finish line and more a new baseline, a reorganized gravity to which future experiences adhere. Why you often don't notice the rewiring. The mind prefers continuity. Neural and narrative plasticity favor local updates over global restarts. The Hermetic set operates precisely by creating those local updates in multiple mutually reinforcing arenas. Attention selects different features, patterns migrate across scales, micro-rituals stabilize physiology, cycles allow for feedback, small causes ripple outward, and creative receptive alternation integrates novelty. Because each intervention is low cost and often private, it escapes the mind's grand story register. The identity narrative, the ledger of who I am, is slow to update because it is risk-averse. So the practical shifts accumulate under the threshold of self-scrutiny until they cross into a new attractor, and the person discovers, retrospectively, that they are not who they were. Signs the rewiring has occurred without dramatic revelation. You find yourself irritated less quickly by things that used to escalate. A different set of curiosities occupies your free time. People around you respond with new questions or assumptions about what you care about. Small decisions, booking a trip, saying no, returning a favor, feel less freighted. Your dreams perhaps change tone, or you notice a different interior dialogue at moments of stress. These changes are discreet, often low sensation, and easy to overlook if you look only for epic transformations. The practiced skill here is noticing micro-differences and journaling them. A simple 7-day experiment to test whether the 7 laws can stealthily rewire parts of your life. Day 1. Mentalism. Start 2 mornings by asking a positive, specific question and record 1 line each evening about what your attention found. Day 2. Correspondence. Move an organizing ritual from a domain you manage well into one you don't. Journal the first observable shift. Day 3. Vibration. Introduce a 3-breath pre-task ritual before 3 tasks. Note changes in focus. Day 4. Polarity. When a strong reaction occurs, map it 0-10 and do 1 small action that nudges it 1 point. Day 5. Rhythm. Hold a short weekly rehearsal, or choose a weekly anchor this day, and mark 3 patterns you notice about the week. Day 6. Cause and effect. Intentionally seed 3 small causes across the day, a compliment, a pause, a clarifying question. Observe ripples. Day 7. Gender. Pair a creative slot and a receptive slot and note differences in completion and tone. Each evening, write 1 line about any feeling that seemed different or any surprising response from the world. After 7 days, read the log. Look for thread-like changes, not seismic shifts. This is an experiment in seeing whether low-energy, repeated acts layer to form new habits of attention. A caution about destabilization and the ethical use of these practices. Shifts in attention and habit can reveal neglected material. That is often useful, but it can also feel destabilizing. If you encounter material that feels overwhelming, intrusive, or unsafe, intense panic, flashbacks, suicidal thoughts, or dissociation, seek professional support. These micro-practices are not substitutes for clinical therapy. If you are in active crisis, please prioritize trained help. The Hermetic mindset here is modest. These laws are lenses and levers, not therapeutic guarantees. Grounding practices to consider as you experiment. Maintain sleep, basic movement, social contact, and a simple daily routine such as washing the face or a 10-minute walk. Keep someone in your life informed if you plan to engage in intense inner work. Community, narrative containment, and practical care reduce risk and make integration more likely. A final synthesis, the alchemical image and the ethics of invisible rewiring. Imagine a crucible on a low, steady flame. Into it you pour many small elements, salt, lead, an herb, a scrap of metal, each small and seemingly insignificant. Alone, none would transmute the others. Together, under the patient heat and the right sequence of stirring and cooling, their relations change. A new alloy emerges. The Hermetic Laws are the recipe language for that patient chemistry. Select your lens, mentalism, map patterns, correspondence, set micro-tempos, vibration, soften binaries, polarity, arrange larger cadences, rhythm, place small causes, cause and effect, and balance creation with reception, gender. The ethical spine of this approach is humility. You are not chasing instant miracles. You are learning how to place small seeds in a life that is willing to be tended. There is also an ethical dimension to this method in social life. When you use these laws to shape attention, consider the effects on others. Emma's change in leadership tone did not merely change her inner state. It altered the emotional labor of her team. Plant causes responsibly. Use experiments transparently when they affect others. The aim is not manipulation, but co-creation. Testing ways of being that are good for you and, insofar as possible, not harmful to the people who share your context. One last practical note on how to be a better witness of slow change. Become a diligent chronicler. Keep a slim notebook or a note file. Each evening, jot one line. What felt different? What surprised you? One sentence about a behavior you did that you wouldn't have done a month ago. Over weeks, those lines weave into a map that shows where attractors are forming. In Jungian language, you're attending to symbols as they reorganize, making what was latent less latent. That habit of observation is itself a hermetic practice. You create the mental conditions in which reconfiguration can be seen. An image to close with, the mandala. Jung often used the mandala as an image of psychic wholeness, a circle of integration where disparate parts find proportion. Think of the mandala not as an achievement, but as a working map. The center shifts as the radius fills differently. The 7 Hermetic Laws are like contours on that mandala. Each law shades a sector of attention, ritual, polarity, timing, causality, and creative reception. As you practice them, gentle, repeated, ethically, you may one morning notice that the center of your mandala feels warmer, less brittle, more hospitable. Perhaps you will not recall the exact second it shifted. That is the point. The transformation happens by degrees, assembled in ordinary acts until a new gravity holds. If you choose to try the 7-day experiment, use it as a modest test rather than a verdict. Write one line each evening and, after the week, read them aloud to yourself or share them with a friend. Notice patterns and practice gentleness with yourself. If something large surfaces, seek a skilled companion. If the experiment helps, consider extending the practices into rhythms that suit your life. Try it. 7 small invitations across 7 days, each asking your attention to tilt a fraction. Watch quietly for the ways the world answers. If you find something to share, one small ripple that surprised you, post it in the comments or in a community thread. There is value in naming the slow change, because naming is one of the easiest ways to make the invisible legible. The Hermetic set, rendered as psychological tools, offers a cartography for subtle steering. They will not promise treasure, they propose a method. Change what you repeatedly notice, what you routinely do, and what you seed into the world. And over time, the mind, like a landscape, changes. That change can be as ordinary and as profound as a different morning question, a new weekly anchor, a single pause before replying. It is, in the best sense, alchemical, patient, respectful of process, and committed to the slow work of turning base impressions into something nearer to gold.